This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 118 of Here's How for the 1st of April 2021. A lot of complaints are made about farmers in Ireland, most of them centre on money, so in this podcast we'll talk to someone who's happy to fight the farmer's corner.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
In a few minutes we'll have this. But you were breaking the law. I mean, those tractors were not taxed and insured for driving long distances on urban roads.
Well, as I said, they were part of a protest.
That's coming up shortly. But first I want to thank all of my donors on Patreon, especially Dave McGinn, who signed up as a patron since the last podcast. I really appreciate everyone who does that. For the people who don't know what it is, Patreon is basically a website that allows you to donate €1 or €2 per podcast or per month. And that helps me to devote more time to research and finding interesting guests for the podcast. You can think of it as a way to support independent media, as one of our other patrons tweeted a while back. If you think that you could do the same as Dave and the other donors, there's details on the website and at the end of the show. Things that seem good aren't always good, and things that seem bad aren't always bad, and things that are really good or really bad can sometimes have confounding outcomes. If you get 3 education spokespersons in a studio, they'll usually come out with at least 4 plans to reform the Leaving Cert. There might be a lot of proposals out there, but they all use the same buzzwords and phrases. Too much stress, continual assessment, can't judge someone by an exam grade, credit for coursework, judge the whole student, no job interviewer will ask for it, reduce exam pressure. Mix in all those cliches with a few badly thought out ideas, half-bake them for a 3-minute interview, and hey presto, you've got an education policy. Yes, there is some merit in some of these ideas that are proposed, and yes, there are terrible things about the Leaving Cert. They're all well rehearsed. I don't need to repeat them all here. But the thing is that it makes sense to talk about what is wrong with it. That's how we solve problems. But we could be ignoring some of its good points. And as for mixing up good and bad, the Daily Mail is a paper with, to say the least, an inglorious track record. Celebrity news and gossip has always been the mainstay of the Daily Mail, but directed by its owner Lord Rothermere, it was an enthusiastic supporter of Mussolini, Hitler and Nazis in general in the 1930s. It was sympathetic to the racist apartheid government in South Africa in the 1970s and 80s. And the paper still regularly uses any story where it can link immigrants to crime as its splash headline, and it was reported to the UK Press Complaints Commission in 1997 for anti-Irish bias. Their science coverage is so bad that the British doctor and science writer Ben Goldacre laughed about their never-ending campaign to categorise every substance in the universe into one of 2 categories: those that cause cancer and those that cure it. In the background there, that's the 1990s punk band Antidote and their track Shock Horror. No surprise that they pinpoint the Daily Mail as one of the many offenders in stoking up racism in Britain.
Prices are higher than ever before, but you won't find that in the Star. In the prices of the sun, you're right if you want, and that's great.
Antidote won't be happy to hear that the Daily Mail has now overtaken the Sun as the best-selling newspaper, the best-selling paper in the UK.
Patriation, intimidation, condemnation.
The Irish edition of the Daily Mail was launched in 2006 using international news and all the celebrity and entertainment content from the British edition wrapped in a few pages of Irish news provided by reporters here.
All over the Times and a markup which burned out the shop. Had a screwed up Daily Mail stuck inside the top.
So, importing a dodgy British tabloid, nothing good could come of that, right? Except the Irish Daily Mail is building a modestly impressive record of breaking exclusive political stories in the Irish market.
Oh hell, the patriot who always buys his government-sponsored media lies. Who spends each lunch break getting filled with shit. Who pays for it and who believes in it. Shock! Horror!
That record was massively boosted at the end of last week with the front page splash by Craig Hughes about the Beacon Hospital diverting COVID vaccines to some of the teachers in the exclusive private school attended by the children of the Beacon CEO, with follow-ups on how the Beacon was offering vaccines as much on the basis of your connections as your need. I think that the importance of this is not being appreciated. As we've heard on this podcast, many of Ireland's problems flow from power being held by a cosy cartel of people who protect and look out for each other. And, as we've heard on this podcast, Irish journalists are particularly prone to both protecting that cartel and sometimes participating in it. The Daily Mail, for all its flaws, isn't part of that. Its parent company just wants to make a quick buck by repurposing its content for the Irish market. It's not even a big part of their empire. It only sells about 25,000 copies a day. Their executives probably couldn't even spell or even name any Irish political parties, much less care about their fate. So if a story bumps up the circulation, then it can go in the news section. It's as simple as that. That's why, if we get to hear about establishment corruption in Ireland, increasingly we hear it from an often racist title whose anti-Semitic founder was the epitome of the establishment for our former colonial masters. Good out of bad, maybe? But what of the bad out of good? For all of the criticism of the Leaving Cert, of how brutal it is, we have to remember one thing. It is brutally fair. Students are judged by someone they've never met who knows nothing about them and can't even identify them other than through an anonymous code number. It's the only aspect of our whole education system that is immune to strokes. All the grind schools, extra lessons, private education, winks, nods, and even diversity of backgrounds that means some kids arrive at school already able to read, while others can't even hold a crayon. None of that can change the fact that if Mary does a better exam than Johnny, she gets the grade and he doesn't. And all this is vitally important because the Leaving is our university entrance exam. It is truly competitive because of the limited number of college places. This is a zero-sum game where every benefit given to one student is a loss to another. So anything helping Johnny to get that university place is denying a place to Mary or some other student. With COVID, that has been disrupted, particularly by using the input of teachers to assess the student's final grade. It's notable that almost all the proposals for reform involve fewer exams and therefore more reliance on assessment by teachers. That might be coursework marked by teachers, references given by teachers, continual assessment by teachers. Outside the elaborate security of exam halls, the reliance on soft, fuzzy judgments of teachers, not to mention their integrity, is absolute. I'm sure that most teachers are honest, but even the best of us are influenced by whether someone is likable, known to us, or other factors that really shouldn't sway our judgment, but do. So any reforms should have regard for the fact that in small-town Ireland, your kid could end up competing for a university critical grade with a kid whose father helpfully arranged that teacher to get a mortgage, or to get planning permission, or to skip the vaccine queue. That's a really good reason to stick with anonymised exams.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On the line, I have Daniel Long. Daniel and his family farm 120 acres in South Tipperary, and Daniel is running for president of Macra na Feirme. Why are you doing that, Daniel?
Thanks for having me on the show, William. I suppose I've always been an active member of Macra na Feirme in my local club in Rathkeevan. And I suppose Macra over the last couple of years, I suppose we've had uncontested elections and never been a real believer in coronations. I believe in democracy and giving our members a chance to vote. And I said that I put my head above the pulpit and run. I'm a firm believer that the organisation needs to be members led from the bottom up rather than the top down. And I think we're living proof in our own club that what can be done when people, like-minded people, come together and grow a club. We started from very modest beginnings.
And what sort of thing do you do?
As a Macra.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose there is a kind of perception out there that it's exclusively for farmers, but it's 60% of our members actually are from a non-farming background. People of all walks of life, so you can participate in sport, you can participate in public speaking. If you're looking to fill up your social calendar for the year, there's a range of events nationwide around the country. There's the opportunity to, as a farmer, to provide lobbying as an organisation to represent young farmers. But that's something I see as the organisation, which I'd like to see moving forward, is an opportunity to actually lobby for young people in general, particularly in rural Ireland. Is that rural-based? It's not so much rural-based. Like, we'd have members from cities and towns around the country as well. But like, there's an awful lot of talk around, say, rural Ireland and revitalising it. But ultimately, young people are the key to revitalising it. And those young people require a vehicle which Macra can provide to lobby for them, be it for rural broadband or rural jobs or infrastructure for people to come and work and live in rural Ireland.
And what would you do differently to anybody else running Macra?
Well, I suppose I am very much a candidate from the outside, and by that I mean I would have never sat on any of the national committees of the organisation. I would have sat on my own local club and my own county regional committees. My opponent is very much the opposite. He's sat on various national committees and currently sitting on the board of the organisation. But I suppose what I would do differently is that, I suppose, as Macra and a criticism, I've spoken to many clubs throughout around the country, that the opinion of the organisation or the issues that the organisation voices isn't necessarily reflective of the opinion on the ground. And so something I would like to do is reach out to members on a monthly basis.
How is it different?
How is it different? Well, take for example farming issues. Macra, I suppose, take their stance on a lot of the issues that are related to farming at the moment probably is weak, and we tend to take the path of least resistance as an organisation.
You're talking about things that I think you want to get maybe a little bit more militant, Daniel. You were involved in the protests about beef prices, and you are concerned about the Beef Task Force. For people who know nothing about that, what is the Beef Task Force?
I suppose you kind of have to go back in time. It's 2019, it's a while ago now, but I suppose in late 2019, farmers, the price of cattle had dropped substantially below the cost of production in 2019, and farmers across the country went out in protest at the gates of various factories around the country. And I suppose after a number of weeks of protest, discussions took place, and the Beef Task Force was established, which was essentially a forum that would allow the farm organisations, the meat industry and the various government departments discuss the issues that are surrounding beef price, sustainability and I suppose moving forward.
So for people who aren't maybe not as rural based who listen to this podcast, I know we have lots of listeners in the rural areas as well, but people who are not familiar with that, there's a fairly limited number of beef processing plants, meat factories in Ireland, and farmers get for their cattle the price that those factories are willing to pay. And when that price goes down, then farmers are losing money. And I think most people who know anything about economics would say, okay, well, when the price goes down, the purpose of that is to push some producers out of business because there's too much product in the market. And then when some go out of business, then supply goes down, price goes back into equilibrium. Why shouldn't we just let that happen?
Well, there's a number of reasons why we shouldn't, but if you follow that logic right through to the end, the image that when you go into the supermarket to buy your meat or to buy your produce, you see a picture of a green grass, and you see a family there, and there's a farm, and generally you associate that with a small holding, and basically people looking after on a day-to-day, tending to their animals in nearly a personal sense. If we follow that logic, as you're suggesting, that you're going to end up very similar to the farms in South America and the continent Europe, where you have thousands of cattle in a feedlot. It's literally factory farming, and there won't be
that's a separate issue. I think you're mixing up two different issues there, because yes, there are standards, and quite likely some consumers would like particular standards to be met. And indeed, in recent years, in different products, standards have been pushed up by consumer demand. But this is where it's quite likely that farmers are just producing too much product. And if that happens, it's inevitable the price will go down, isn't it?
Well, ultimately, the retailers aren't losing money on the product, and the processors, like if you look at the figures, the processors have thrown out, they turned over 8 billion euros out of meat in Ireland in 2020. But the farmers are the ones that are losing. The price of inputs, be it fertilizer or feed into those animals, remains high. So it can't always be the farmer that loses out, but ultimately the person that actually puts in 90% of the work is the person that gets the least, and that's not sustainable.
Roll that back there for a moment, because, and I don't want to hit you with economics, and this isn't meant to be an economics class. We let David McWilliams do that podcast. But the fact is that farmland in Ireland costs 10 times more than the same quality farmland in France. And it's pretty obvious economic law, but you don't have to be a genius or have a PhD in economics to know it, that the price of a particular good dictates the price of whatever resource yields that good. So basically, if the price of gold goes up, the price of a gold mine will go up as well. If the price of land in Ireland is very high, that doesn't indicate that farmers can't make a buck, does it?
No, it's very. I suppose it's important to note land isn't something that's still in production, so there's a limited quantity of it. But
and that's true in France as it is in Ireland.
It is, but you see, there's an awful number of private subsidiaries or people that make substantial incomes outside of farming that are looking to invest, and land is a reasonable investment for those people. And I suppose that's what drives the price of land. Irish land is keenly sought after around the world, even from the thoroughbred industry for horse racing or high quality limestone land.
Sure, yeah, but doesn't raw economics then dictate that some of these people who are producing beef that nobody really wants to buy at the price that they need to make in order to make a buck when they're producing it, some of them should then convert into other products?
Totally agree, and that's what I said. And that's what I said.
And if we have the great and the good in this beef committee all sitting around a table, I suppose it's not a smoke-filled room anymore, but it might not even be a room, it might be a Zoom conference these days. But if we have the great and the good sitting around deciding that the price of beef needs to be so much, then what that is doing is it is inhibiting a price signal from the consumer who's saying, I don't want so much beef. And it's stopping that price signal from going to the farmer, isn't it?
It is, and as I said, the beef task force, to answer your question in a long-winded kind of way, if it turns out and that I suppose the theory that we were producing too much of it and there isn't a market for this beef, well then as Macra and as a farm organ, we need to look at alternatives, and alternatives, as I mentioned, renewables is a clear alternative that can also benefit our carbon emissions problem that we have in this country and our climate targets that we have to meet, while allowing beef farmers to remain in that sector, maybe not at as intensive a level.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment. Put a pin in that because I want to come back to that thought. But I just want to ask you, in general, a lot of people, especially urban people, get the impression that farmers think that the same rules don't apply to them as to the rest of the population. Is that true?
In what sense?
In a whole range of things. And there's kind of a feeling, and I know this is not something that's popular in rural Ireland, but it's important that people talk honestly and tell each other their feelings.
I think it's important. I suppose as President William, is something that I would like. I think it's important that farmers do engage with people in urban Ireland. There isn't a divide, and that there is a kind of an education for both sides.
But you can see how urban people get the impression that farmers think that the world owes them a living. That if somebody who lives in a city, who maybe works in a VHS video cassette factory, or in a factory that was making lead for leaded petrol or whatever, if suddenly their product isn't wanted anymore, they don't get a committee of the great and the good and politicians being delegated to sit around the table to force people to pay the price for that product that's no longer wanted. And farmers want that to happen for them. Can you see how that feels like an inequality?
Well, not so much. I suppose it is every farmer is self-employed. So if they don't do a good job,
a lot of people are self-employed.
They are self-employed, but I suppose it's also important to note that Europe have a cheap food policy, which is right. It allows people people don't starve and people aren't on the street. And in order for that cheap food policy to be in place, it means that the price of goods and produce that we produce is obviously less. It wasn't there.
Yeah, but we did a piece on this podcast a few episodes back, and the price of electronic goods, things like fridges, cookers, that sort of thing, is lower now in absolute terms than it was in the 1980s. Not even taking inflation into account, just the actual number of euros you'd pay for a cooker is less now than you would pay in the 1980s, which is a very long time ago and has a lot of inflation since then. It's not realistic for every industry just to expect the government to dictate the price, is it?
As I said, farming is a unique case. Like we produce food, we deal with animals, we're dealing with the climate. I think that it's important to remember as well that Irish people tend to like to eat Irish, and we like to produce Irish food. Many of those industries you're mentioning they have grown over the years. Technology has expanded, and they're generally mass produced. You can't apply those same standards onto farming because in order to maintain what is known as the stereotypical family farm, their costs of production are higher, and they don't have the capabilities. I suppose the general public don't want them to have the capabilities or the desire to turn themselves into
but farmers. A lot of consumers will pay more, for example, for free-range eggs. And let me just give you an example of what comes across to me as special pleading on the part of farmers. And you'll be well acquainted with the Mercosur agreement. And this is the for people who don't know it, this is a trade deal between a group of South American nations and the EU. And the IFA, and I think Macra and certainly yourself, have protested really very vigorously against this because this allows 99,000 tonnes of beef from South America into the EU market. Now, to put that in context, 99,000 tonnes of beef works out, given that there's about 450 million people in the EU, 99,000 tonnes of beef works out at about 220 grams, which would be roughly a Big Mac, for each European person per year. That's not a lot. One Big Mac a year worth of beef. In contrast to that, Ireland gets a whole range of benefits, but one that just stuck out to me was the removal of all tariffs on pharmaceutical goods from the EU being exported to South America. At the moment, there's a 14% duty on that. That makes it uneconomic for Ireland's pharmaceutical industry, which is massive and employs thousands, many tens of thousands of people and brings many, many billions into the country every year. Doesn't it seem a little bit petty for farmers to say this whole agreement should be ditched because it adds something like 1% to the total amount of beef in the European market? Well,
I suppose my answer to that would be that if you look at Europe imposes standards on its farmers to produce goods to a standard. It's a little bit disingenuous to kind of expect that we also have climate standards that we're expected to meet and targets we're expected to meet. But to go and buy beef from a country that doesn't have those climate standards...
No, we're not buying beef. That's down to the individual... We're trading. That's down to the individual customer or importer or whatever. They are allowed to buy up to a total of 99,000 tonnes of... That's all trade right across the EU once per year. As I said, working out to roughly one Big Mac per person per year. We have agreed really a very, very modest amount of access for South America to our beef market. And in return, we're getting a whole load of tariffs removed from exports that we make to South America, including, as I said, removed from pharmaceuticals. That's a huge net benefit for Ireland, wouldn't you agree?
It's a net benefit, but it's at what cost? Like, as I said, if we are serious, and I've spoken to many people about climate change and our emissions, then economics and I suppose climate are two very different things, and we need to be able to separate them out. As I said, the countries that were bringing these beef in, regardless to the small and modest number per person, it's still 90,000 tonnes, and it's still coming from a country that's generating huge emissions and cutting down rainforests to generate those beef in those feedlots to bring it across. I suppose it's also important to note that I think Austria have vetoed that deal as is, and I think other countries may follow suit.
I think you'll find it's agricultural industries in Austria that are pressing for that.
Yeah, but as I said, I'm open to correction on that. But as I said,
what you said is correct. But it is the agricultural lobby within Austria that's pushing that particular position. But you mentioned climate change and so forth. In Ireland, we have committed to, and this is showing up in the news for other reasons at the moment, but as every country in the world must get to net zero carbon by 2050. Agriculture in Ireland accounts for 1/3 of our carbon emissions. There's no hope of getting to that target without massive changes in agriculture. That's true, isn't it?
100% agree. It's probably the basis of a lot of my campaign. And it's something that radical change need to come over the next something. I wouldn't be one to ever deny that global warming isn't happening, or carbon, or emissions levels aren't there. But I think there's an opportunity there to address it in a meaningful way that can benefit all.
Sure there is, but would you agree that when the agricultural sector by a mile is producing the most carbon, there's just no way for us to get within an ass's roar of net zero unless there's huge change in agriculture? That's true, isn't it?
Yeah, and I suppose it's also important to aware of that, and I think Tagus are doing studies on it as we speak, of the amount of carbon that agriculture actually sequesters. Those figures aren't thrown out widely at the moment, but hopefully in the coming months and years that we will get to see an accurate reflection of those figures.
Sure, that's true. But nevertheless, what I want to ask you is, how are you going to do that? Do you have any way to get even modest reductions? Whereas, you really have to eliminate that whole of that 33% of Ireland's total carbon.
I think there is a review needed on the expand. I think it's in a lot of newspapers and it's fairly widespread in the media of our expanding dairy herd. I think the model that we're following at the moment is a New Zealand-based model that's based around a small cow that's low maintenance, but we need quite a number of them to generate. I think we need to look at maybe producing a more robust type cow where we have less cows producing an equal amount of milk, therefore reducing our emissions. I also think we need to...
that would reduce the emissions. It's not going to eliminate them.
Yeah. But as I said, to get to net zero, we need to look at alternatives. As I said, we have huge potential in this country for solar and wind, and as there's a number of...
That's all about energy consumption. But this isn't about energy consumption. And to put it in context, transport, which could possibly be gotten to zero or close to it if there was an absolutely massive change to electric cars and to active transport. And I've no idea how anybody's ever going to have an electric truck. But if that whole thing happened, that would account for getting rid of 20% of our carbon emissions. Agriculture accounts for 33%. That's a much, much bigger ask. And, when you say that there needs to be a review and so forth, it kind of sounds like a man whose house on fire says that he wants to set up a committee to examine the price of fire extinguishers.
Well, I wouldn't say so much a review. I would say very much clear policy. As I've said,
But surely that one of the policies has to be a big move away from meat eating and beef in particular.
Well, I don't think that's ever going to be the case. I suppose it's also important to note that the aviation industry pays no carbon tax at the moment, and they are huge emitters of aviation. But
about 2%. As opposed to 33% from agriculture. And you're right, they pay no tax on that fuel. But, the whataboutery doesn't work here, because unless there's massive reform in farming and probably massive diet changes, which will mean way less meat being eaten, that target which is essential really to the survival of humanity on the planet, that target isn't going to be met, is it?
Well, ultimately, it comes down to a choice. And I know from my own members in Macra and Feirme, there's an awful lot of young farmers in the country, and they are looking to adapt and change their ways that they farm. I suppose at the moment there isn't proper supports there to allow them to do that, but I think we'll be underestimating our young farmers to say that they're not capable and aware that changes need to be made.
Really, because I find that interesting because, and you know, you're clearly aware of the issues and you're clearly a farmer. That's your concern and you're concerned for looking out for other farmers, and that's completely legitimate. But I've been having a look at some Facebook groups of farmers around the country, and I have to say that your attitude is not reflected there, and it would not be out of place in a Donald Trump fan Facebook page, a lot of the comments about climate change. Are you sure that the attitudes are as progressive as you make them out?
Well, I suppose it would be very important to look at the age demographic of a lot of those people that are in these Facebook groups that you're referring to. I think there is, like in everything in life, change is fearful. People generally fear change, but like when you educate people around and actually show them the benefits and the alternatives and how they can benefit, people are generally very adaptable, and I've no doubt that's what farmers as well. I suppose in my other life, before COVID, I used to teach IT to farmers and basic IT, and you could see farmers coming in and they'd be very nervous around technology and phones and stuff. And after a day or two, they were doing as good as anybody. But I suppose that was a real kind of poignant example to me that farmers are adaptable and they are open to change if the conditions are right for them to do that. And that's the reason why I'm running. I'm running because but I'm also keenly aware, like we have 60% of our members that don't come from a farming background, and that's where I intend to start with, is re-educating them around, I suppose, a lot of the issues that are in agriculture and maybe looking how farmers are adapting. I think I suppose the general public probably aren't aware that farmers are making the change now. So that I'm not going to argue with you, William. There is a lot of changes that need to be made, but I suppose every marathon has to start with a walk, like, you know. So,
okay, and that's fair enough. One other thing, because I mentioned, and I think perhaps I was a little bit unfair to you about the farmers not being exposed to the market that most other people who work in whatever industry are. Part of the problem, though, for the farmers is that the beef industry, that's to say the meat producers, that's a very narrowly controlled cartel. People will know the name Larry Goodman very well, and there's a very small number of, to put it politely, well-connected people who own those beef plants. Is it healthy that farming is so political? That's to say, if you're a butcher or a baker, or, well, I'll leave out butcher, but if you're a baker or a candlestick maker, you don't really care what the government does. You go about your business and you produce your product and you sell it, and if you go out of business, somebody else will take over that business if it's still a worthwhile business. But as we saw in going back into the beef tribunal and so forth, that seems to be more controlled by politics and also farming, and not to say EU subsidies. The whole thing is politicized. Do you think that's a negative thing? And you mentioned New Zealand. Do you think that the model that New Zealand have taken, which is no subsidies and farmers obviously obey the law and so forth, but they're allowed to operate in a completely free market, do you think that's better?
Well, I've always said that. And my own fellow farmers would shoot me for it, but I would much prefer a system where we weren't relying on EU subsidies and that we were getting a fair price for our product that we could produce. It's the world we live in, and you are correct in saying that a small number of very large meat producers literally run the meat industry in this country. And I suppose a lot of that is down to smaller abattoirs and butchers find it very difficult to get into the market, or I suppose smaller factories. I suppose it's also important to note that the rendering capacities in the country is owned by an even smaller few, and in order to slaughter or process meat in this country, you need access to rendering, and that's proven difficult. But yes, farming politics is very political, and I suppose that's something I would like to change. I don't want to get bogged down in politics. If I'm lucky enough to become president, I much prefer to relay with my members and then go back and speak clearly. And if something isn't possible, just to say it's not possible. But my responsibility is solely to the members of the organisation and not to boards, committees, or other forums that I may sit on. And,
okay,
that's my reason for running.
Okay, that's fair enough. And you mentioned that actually a reasonable percentage, or maybe even a majority of the organisation, is not strictly speaking farming, although I think they would probably be quite rural
Yeah, it
in
would have
their
a farm.
backward. No, hold on for one second, because I know you have with your family a medium-sized farm. You told me 120 acres.
Yeah.
Can you tell me, for urban people who don't know, what is the EU payment that's associated with that?
Well, that's very variable. It depends on the reference year, and it depends on what the old subsidy system would pay. There will be no. It's not by the amount of acres you own. There's some farms with 1,000 acres and they have no EU payment.
Give me a typical figure.
Okay, so around, I suppose the average payment in this country is somewhere in the region of about 10,000 a year.
No, but average, that also would count in a lot of people who have sort of a very small hobby farm. So that would bring down the average.
That would be, and then for
the full-time farmers, what would the average figure be?
20 to 25,000, but those figures are freely available on the Department of Agriculture's website. You can actually go through everybody in the country what they're getting. I would be very strongly against any payments above 40,000. I don't think it's fair or right. I think that anything above 40,000 should be, once you go over that, the excess should be spread out amongst the lower payments in the system.
Okay, but Daniel, just to perhaps illustrate the political power of farmers, there are still in this country agricultural workers who don't own any land themselves, who are employed on other people's farms. I don't know if you employ anybody. Those people are generally not very well paid. Would you agree?
No, I wouldn't, because I actually work off farm myself.
Farms who hire a farmhand, that's tough work and it's not the greatest pay.
It depends on where you come in. If you come in as a student, obviously, that's across many professions or many. But like I said, it's based on ability. It's based on experience. But
it's often people who are living in very rural areas who have very few employment options without moving away.
Well, that's true too. But as I said, the building industry is playing a big role in that. A lot of those people are being drawn away.
That's true. And the numbers in that have declined. But it's true, isn't it, that those people get absolutely zero in terms of EU payments?
The workers?
Yes. People who do not own land, people who are employed.
As I said, within Macra, there is a forum called the Land Mobility Service, which allows people that maybe not come from a farming background the opportunity to own shares in cows or farms.
No, that's a different issue. That's what I'm focusing on. Farm labourers, people who maybe have a relationship with a farmer over a long time and do farm work for someone who owns a farm. Those people generally have quite limited employment options, often have really quite low pay, and they get zero out of the EU payments. Those three things are true, aren't they?
Well, obviously they get zero of the EU payments because they don't own land. But as for low pay, I would disagree, because I said there's a lot of people making a very good living out of working on farms and working on farms in general. But I said without having to say, I suppose on an individual case by case basis, I couldn't comment. But I suppose in general, if anything, the trajectory of wages is going up rather than down.
Sure, and that's true. But those they're farmers. They don't own a farm, but those you can call them farm labourers or farmers. Those particular farmers operate entirely within a free employment market. That's true, isn't it?
Yeah, as I said, they can work in any sector, but I thought that they choose that they want to work in the agricultural industry.
Okay, and one thing I want to go back to, and you mentioned at the end of 19, at the start of last year, there was a beef protest, and that involved you organising at one stage a protest that brought 700 tractors into the centre of Dublin, to the absolute fury of an awful lot of people in Dublin. Do you think you called that wrong?
At the time, well, I suppose hindsight is foresight. But at the time, it was a very fractious time. As I said, the task force had been set up, and it subsequently never met. There was issues around injunctions over people, etc.
Were you injuncted?
I was injuncted at the time, yes.
Okay.
As I said, I stood at factory gates at the time. But as I said, I knew what I was getting into when I went in there to stand at those gates. I firmly believed that farmers weren't getting enough for their produce. And if I had my time over again, would I do it again? Probably would, because I think...
But specifically, and I get you on, because I think it's important, particularly for maybe listeners who are more on the urban side, to hear your point of view, and I think it's important to hear that. But do you appreciate their point of view that if somebody has a protest, be it an anti-war protest or the Debenhams workers or whatever, they might have a protest, they might have a picket, they might go on a march, but to bring in 700 tractors is an effort to amplify your impact in a way that is not justified by the numbers. And these were obviously agricultural vehicles, I suspect on untaxed diesel. I suspect they weren't, or at least not very many of them, were taxed and insured to drive on the roads and cause absolute chaos for people who had no beef with you. But no other sector of Irish society would be allowed to create that much inconvenience for other people, would they?
Well, I suppose I can't comment on other protests.
Yeah, you can. Go on.
Okay, but as I said, look, at the time, look, as I said, it was an extremely fractious time. Beef farmers basically rely on, as we've already discussed, a very small number of meat processors in the country.
I have a lot of sympathy for you on that point, but I do think that the effect of your protest is to cut off a market signal from the consumer who doesn't want as much beef as before. That signal then doesn't get to the farmer and say, quit producing so much beef. And while you're correct on the cartel about a very small number of factories being the buyers there, and that's unfortunate to the point of being really very unfair on farmers, it is. Well, I don't want to make accusations that I can't stand up, but just to give people the background on that, if those meat factories were to come together and agree only to offer a lower price than the market would demand, that would be a very serious criminal offence. So I don't want to accuse them of that. But they don't really need to do that because there's few enough of them to just watch what each other are doing and they can keep the prices down like that. And I do appreciate that. But the bottom line is, it wasn't the case, and it isn't the case, that you can't get meat on the supermarket shelves. It's not sold out and people having to queue at supermarkets to get meat. There is enough meat produced. Therefore, there is at least enough meat being produced. Therefore, when the demand goes down, the supply has to go down, doesn't it?
Yes, but as I previously mentioned, that
what I'm trying to get you to address is that those 700 tractors blocking up the centre of Dublin and in pre-COVID times did what we thought was a lot of damage to business. That's some way that you can impact urban people's lives in a way that they can't do to you. And nobody, for example, Debenhams, former Debenhams workers, Debenhams, the shop that was closed down in Dublin, they tried to have a very, very minor protest and they felt the wrath of the law pretty quickly. And it seems to an average urban person that farmers can illegally drive tractors uninsured, untaxed on green diesel into the centre of Dublin and nobody gets arrested. It feels like you're in the same category as the beef barons who might have a casual relationship with the law.
Well, I would reject that because I would.
But you were breaking the law. I mean, those tractors were not taxed and insured for driving long distances on urban roads.
Well, as I said, they were part of a protest. It is accepted that our parliament is in the centre of Dublin, and even though the city of Dublin is for, I suppose our parliament is for all the citizens of our country. And when protests need to take place, people are entitled to gather, whatever means that protest takes place at the time. But I think it's also important to note many of the people we met on Dublin those couple of days, one, probably didn't really understand the scale of the problem. They probably didn't follow the protests that were at the gates at the time. And two, I suppose, actually recognise that the hardships that farmers were actually going through. I suppose everyone in this country is no more than 2 generations away from a farm if they count back.
This is true, or less.
Farming is very much ingrained in our society. And I suppose,
but isn't that the problem that if Computer Factory or whatever closes down in Ireland, people say tough luck for the workers. When it's the farmers who are feeling hardship, they say call in the minister, get the law changed, get a subsidy.
But as I said, like land is something. It runs a lot deeper for, I suppose, other the culture in this nation. Like, what do we want?
But are you exploiting that fact in order to have a cushier life than anybody else?
I wouldn't say we're exploiting any fact. Like I said, that there was a task force set up by the government to appease basically the protests that were going on in the autumn, and that task force never sat.
I understand that, but deal with the issue that farmers are treated differently to workers in other industries. Does the world owe you a living in the way that it doesn't to somebody in making VHS tapes when that factory closes down?
As we have already discussed, is that we do have a cheap food policy in this country, which means that we don't get probably the proper value for the produce that we produce. And I think ultimately then that's fund that has to be funded somewhere. Like, and like we're in the situation now, like there's no worker in the country. Like if you're on a bad job and you're not getting proper pay, you'll either leave that job and find a better job. But if you're a farmer and you produce beef or you're producing produce, if your profession is farming and you're not getting proper pay, there's no alternative job. Like you can buy another farm down the road and you're still going to run into the same problem. Like, I think that's the crux of it. And I said farming, like there is no millionaire that I know of. Like most farmers, the average income isn't. I think it's 40,000 is the average income for full-time farmers, and it's far less than for part-time farmers that are.
Hold. I'm going to stop you there. That's very easy to manipulate the figures because there's a whole load of people who own a couple of acres and sometimes, their daughter's pony is on it, who earn zero from their farm. So if you add them in, that brings the average way down.
Well, what I can say categorically from my own experience and people living around in my own area, that what they make out of dry stock farming is probably a loss, and their job covers the cost of the farm. They're working off farm. The farm is literally it's a dedication more than a job, and
it's a hobby.
That's not.
There are hobby farmers in Ireland.
They are, but like at the end of the day, like they deserve, like in any business, you deserve to be paid at least. Like
you deserve to be paid what the market sets the price at.
Well, as I said, like we've discussed this at length. Like if there is no market for the beef, as you were saying, and if the shops are full of that, if the shops don't need to take in more selling because the consumer isn't buying the product, well then obviously the hit should come on the retailers and the processors and the farmers equally. But like when you have a situation when your processors turning record profits and your retailers making profit and farmers losing money, there's something wrong along the chain.
And finally,
I think
finally, Daniel, if you were to give a pitch to the average Macra member listening to say in one sentence why the organisation would be better at the end of your presidency than at the start of it, what would that be in one sentence?
In one sentence, I think that then in the next election, that I hope by the end of my term that there will be people fighting to become president actually for nominations than there was this time, and actually we have a far stronger voice than we had before, and I suppose transparent leadership is how I kind of intend to lead if lucky enough to be elected.
Daniel Long, County Tipperary farmer with the rest of your family, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you very much.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Record a contribution to be included in the next show. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
The election for the president of Macra na Feirme is currently underway by postal ballot. The one other candidate is John Keane of North Tipperary, and ballot papers must be received back by 1 p.m. on Wednesday the 7th of April. Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Daniel Long, who's just set up a Twitter account at Daniel Long Macra. And get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. Thanks again to Dave and all the other patrons on Patreon. Their donations allow me to devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate €1 or $2 per podcast or per month, please do go to patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.